Um, Welcome to this webinar. Um, we'll just give it a few more minutes. Lovely to see some familiar names in the room. Thank you all for joining us. Hi, everyone. Hi, Khadijat. Thank you.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hi. Thank you all for joining us for today's discussion. We know that quite a number of people registered for today, so we will just give it another minute or so before we start. Shirley, maybe you can just send a follow-up message to Darlington and see just that he's got the time right. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. This is a webinar that's part of a series of 3 webinars that we will be hosting with the AI for Development research community, which is a community that is supported by the International Development Research Centre of Canada and the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office of the UK. It is, I think, the largest and longest standing funding program on the African continent that supports the AI ecosystem across 3 pillars, talent, policy, and innovation. And this particular topic, AI safety, what it means from an African perspective, was a topic that was of interest to a number of us within this community. And so us at the Global Centre on AI Governance, under our African Observatory on Responsible AI project, which is a project supported by the AI for D programme, worked with a number of authors from across the continent, experts from the AI for D programme and beyond it, to think about what does it mean to think about this really kind of critical, timely debate on the safety and security of AI systems that is becoming very prominent in a global space. What does it mean to think about these questions from an African perspective? What nuances does the African continent, with this complex and diverse security, political, economic, and social environment, what do these conditions mean in the context of the large-scale risks associated with artificial intelligence? We really wanted to think about as well the kind of imbalance between huge investments going into AI development. And we know the kind of AI divide question around how expensive and costly it is to build AI systems, and how much is going into funding the development of AI in some parts of the world, and how difficult it is to get access to those same resources in the African continent. There's a very good and interesting article in the New York Times that was recently published on this. But by comparison, there is far less investment going into understanding the particular risks to our societies, to our economic and human security around AI, and particularly very little kind of research and work going on around how do these risks manifest within a diverse African context. So that was what this paper was really about. I think there's a really clear opportunity as we're seeing the kind of growth and proliferation and diversification of AI ecosystems across the continent. There is this opportunity to think about how do we build and safeguard these ecosystems so that they do not pose critical risks to human societies and to also our environments. So we have a really, really interesting discussion that we're going to have today. Dr. Samuel Segan, who is the lead author of the paper on an African AI agenda for AI safety, that we'll put the link in the chat. Samuel is a senior researcher at the Global Center on AI Governance, and he will be giving us an overview of this paper and the kind of key recommendations, policy and research agenda setting recommendations. And then we have one of the key authors that was also involved in this, Dr. Scott Timke, who is a senior research associate at Research ICT Africa, who will be giving his remarks in response to what Samuel has discussed and spoken about. And we will also hopefully have Darlington Okogo, who I'm sure many of you know. He's a kind of really significant figure around building AI for good systems within the health sector on the African continent, and has really, really interesting perspectives around how to really build AI safety within the development of AI development on the continent itself, and some of the kind of risks that he has identified throughout his own work. After that, we'll have time for kind of questions, comments, inputs from any of you. And I think what we'll probably do is take questions and comments through the chat, and then I will direct them at our speakers. But thank you all for being here. And Sam, let's turn to you.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. So what I'll attempt to do would be to give a quick overview of the paper that we wrote. I'm sure the paper will be shared in the chat. What we try to do here is to sort of map out the unique AI safety challenges we see that Africa currently faces or is likely to face. And to do that, I'll just like start by explaining what we considered AI safety to be in the research. So the concept of AI safety appears to, at the moment, be moving from just conversations around ethics to conversations around safety, particularly the technical bit of it. But again, the way we try to approach this, we provided a very holistic perspective, knowing that AI safety cuts across several subjects and several disciplines. And so there's a likelihood that we could speak about AI safety from a purely security perspective or ethical perspective or socioeconomic perspective and the like. So what we define AI safety to mean here is an interdisciplinary field that focuses on the security, ethical, socioeconomic, environmental, technical, and existential risk or harms that highly advanced AI systems could bring. And now one of the reasons to talk about these, or why we felt the need to talk about this, is that Africa's perspective to this conversation has been largely missing, largely because the models that are built are not necessarily built with Africa in mind. Much of the challenges Africa faces are not being addressed because Africa is not a key player at the moment in terms of building this technology. So we looked at some reasons why we wanted to work on these, and one would be to mitigate, biases and discrimination, particularly as it affects African people, prevent and manage unintended harm to human, ensure that these systems are built reliably and robustly, which would include, going through several measures of testing. We want to guide against misuse. We already seeing like the proliferation of deep fakes and the potential for surveillance, particularly with governments. We'll talk about that going further. We want to also see the need to promote trust and adoption, support regulation and governance, anticipate long-term risks, and protect vulnerable population, as well as ensure that there's no concentration of power. And when we speak about concentration of power here, we're focused on the big tech companies having the power to most likely dictate how countries are run, how our economies are formed, how economic transactions are carried out. So what we did was we adopted the International AI Safety sort of categorization for AI risk. So we looked at risk from malicious use, risk from malfunction, and what we refer to as systemic risk or system risks. And I'll just give a quick explanation of what these risks are. So risk from malicious use focuses on intentional abuse or weaponization of AI for harmful activities, while risk from malfunction focuses on the negative physical or psychological, or even reputational or financial results or outcomes when AI systems default or when they have flaws in them. And systemic risk focuses on the broader societal consequences that arise from deploying these AI systems, which sometimes go beyond what the models are designed for. So I'll try to run through these risks categories by categories, and I want to leave a lot more for us to have conversation about. So I wouldn't try to give more examples. I'll just do like a quick synopsis of what we covered in the paper. So the risk from malicious use, we looked at risk to democracy and human rights. So here we focused on risks that AI technology presents for surveillance purposes. And what we noted is that many African leaders or African democracies have like very good track record of tolerating opposition, and we fear that the use of the systems could be abused. We're already seeing that with how facial recognition technology being deployed in Africa is being used to curb dissent and curb opposition leaders and their activities, and also people who voice out or go out for protests. And so that's a big concern, the risks to democracy and human rights. We also looked at the risk to manipulation of public opinions, and here we're worried more about how AI generated deepfakes and disinformation, can impact Africa's democratic processes, particularly towards elections. So we've seen this being with the reports from OpenAI, with how ChatGPT was being used to generate propaganda for social media during the last Ghanaian election, presidential election in Ghana. And we're also seeing this across different areas in Africa as well. We're seeing this with health and safety concerns, particularly the last Ebola outbreak in East Africa, DRC, and towards Rwanda. We see that generative AI models were used to generate false prescription or false ways of addressing such outbreaks. We're also concerned about external risks and influence. And here we are looking at the fact that much of these models that are built by countries or companies outside of Africa. And the motivation or the incentive is actually to make, profit. And that is slightly different from the incentives that we would expect and what we would expect for people who want to build an ethically grounded AI systems. And what that could mean would be that they would have more external actors play a significant part in the sovereignty of many African nations, largely because we know that AI is going to disrupt the economic activities as it goes on around the world. And if that's the case, we worry that there could be the challenge when much of the economic activities that go on the continent of Africa is heavily dependent on these companies. Other misuses we looked at include the increasing militarization and abuse or loss of control. At the moment, we do not have a regulatory framework around lethal autonomous weapon systems, and we're beginning to see how even non-state actors use autonomous drones in conflict-ridden areas on the continent. And we also worry that, the increasing militarization of this technology is going to have significant impact, humanitarian impact on the continent, could also exacerbate the conflicts that we see in different areas and also through diplomatic channels, of course. We also looked at the risk of cybercrime and financial malpractice on the continent. We are seeing an increased use of voice cloning tools, some kind of deep fakes as well, for extortion and cybercrime. We're also seeing more attacks on financial institutions. In the paper, we cited, I think, a few billions that have been at risk in the last 1 or 2 years because AI systems, particularly generative AI models, have been used for social engineering to be able to break into financial institutions. We also looked at risks to women and girls, and here we are focused on generative content, particularly abusive content that intensifies online gender-based violence. We're seeing this with how the faces of female celebrities, for instance, are manipulated and put with deep fakes to create porn. And this is a big concern about what it could have for the mental health of women and girls, as we have pointed here, and how this has been used also to invade the privacy of women and create some sort of public shame around it. The risk for malfunction, we looked at reliability and safety concerns. And this particularly, we talked about, a bit of the context bias here. So although AI innovators in Africa are currently developing, new solutions with AI to solve developmental issues like healthcare issues, agricultural issues on the continent, we reckon that reliance on models that were primarily trained on data sets that focuses on say, Euro-America, the challenge is that we worry about their reliability when brought within the context of Africa, where we've got unique challenges and unique perspectives to how we deal with these challenges. And the worry is that we would have some sort of reliability issues. We see that with the problem of hallucination and what that could mean, largely because many of the data sets required to train these models are not focused on the global south and particularly Africa in the context of our paper. We also looked at bias and the question of fairness. Uh, we know that for a very long time, much of the facial recognition models had huge problems with identifying darker skinned individual, and the African continent is filled with people of darker skin. And the challenge we fear is that much of these systems could create the kind of bias and unfairness that could create more rift around gender, around race, around religion, or political viewpoints on the continent when they are used. And in talking about systemic risks, we looked at labor risk and environmental risk. So for labor risk, we looked at Africa's unique economic position at the moment and how much is likely to be disrupted if AI systems or automated systems are introduced into the workforce or the economy on the continent. And we know from the World Economic Forum analysis that about 40% of the global economy is exposed to potential AI disruption. And if that's the case, we worry very much around what that could mean for the African continent, actually, because Africa is not as better prepared compared to, say, Southeast Asia or America or even Europe in preparing for the transition into a fully automated world. For the environmental risk, we looked at certain risks, such as like access to electricity, which will be required for building data centers and the rest. We also looked at the fact that many African countries are at risk or badly positioned in terms of exposure to famine and the risk of water scarcity and what that could have in terms of building coolant systems for data centers. We also looked at the carbon footprint and the challenges that that could pose for the continent because Africa is faced with, in fact, it said that Africa has the most, is likely to have the most impact of environmental related or carbon dioxide emissions related harm that will come from environmental risk posed by AI systems. And we talked about that a little more in the paper. So what can we do about this? We came up with a five-pronged approach that we think could address some of this concern. One of them is the human right-based approach, where we believe that all the conversations around AI safety should be grounded on a human rights-based approach. So what we mean by this is that we want to promote certain values that we consider to be very fundamental, such as non-discrimination, privacy, freedom, expression, freedom of expression, and a more inclusive design process in the design development and the deployment of AI systems. We also looked at the creation of an AI Safety Institute. It's an institute with the primary focus of just examining these risks that we have just mentioned in the paper. And we noted that although Kenya is a part of the International AI Safety Network, it's about the only one without a proper institute here. We know that the institutes have been situated in Canada, in the UK, in the US, in Singapore, but Africa is yet to have one of its that is focused uniquely on the safety concerns as it bothers the public. We also looked at the need for increased public literacy on AI. And one of the reasons we're having this webinar is to have this type of conversations where there's a need to talk about AI safety, AI ethics, and also what it could do for the continent. So we feel that there's still a big gap in terms of public literacy and public understanding of what AI is and the potential dangers and risks that it could pose. We also talked about the need for an early detection system. Here we partners at University of Cape Town, the GCG, and some other partners. We're working on creating an early detection system where we're able to develop and deploy a continent-wide monitoring systems for large-scale driven threats that are posed by AI on the continent. So our goal is to ensure that this is very reflective of the African perspective. And also, we actually benchmarking about 25 plus African languages, commonly spoken or widely spoken African languages for piloting this, just to ensure that there is better understanding of some of the risks, particularly the risk from things like deep fake and public manipulation of public opinion that we feel is one of the most pertinent risks at the moment. Lastly, we talked about regulatory enforcement. We already see gaps around AI legislation on the continent, and thankfully, many countries are picking up the need to create national AI strategies and national AI policies. And what we are doing with that is we are supporting in capacity building, in training, in creating guides, standards, and supporting governments across the continents to ensure that there is more effective regulation around the development, use, and deployment of AI systems on the continent. Thank you very much. Rachel?
Thanks very much, Samuel. So you can see we really explored a kind of full range of risks. And one of the things we were looking to do was to do this partly as a response to the international report on AI safety, which sets out this kind of taxonomy of AI risks in terms of malicious use, malfunction, and then systemic risks. So we followed those categories, but really looked, as Samuel has explained in detail, at what the particular risks, what the evidence is pointing to around what's most concerning and what are kind of underexplored areas, particularly within the kind of global landscape of AI safety risks that are particular to the continent. Thanks so much, Samuel. Before I turn to Darlington and welcome, thank you so much for being here with us. Let's turn now to Dr. Scott Timke. And Scott, it would be really, really interesting. You were one of the key authors on this piece. It'd be really interesting to hear more from you about your kind of key takeaways from this research, but also some of the questions around what kind of infrastructure do we need? Political, social, institutional infrastructure do we need across the continent to be able to mitigate and manage the kind of risks that we might be seeing? So over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. And Samuel, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation to overview this piece of work. It's been quite a journey with so many wonderful colleagues that have been able to really lean in and strengthen this product. There are a couple, remarks that I just sort of want to make and maybe build upon the pointers that Samuel has for us. There are a couple. The first point I think is that the product on the table, the sort of agenda, is technical and scientific is ethical and commercial. It's not simply one silo, it's the attempt to try find a point of view, a project, a pathway that is holistic in nature. One of the difficulties with AI safety, or one of the one very poor way or unwise way of looking at AI safety, is simply to just compartmentalize it. One of the things about LLMs, for example, is their self-referential archival nature. And so we cannot simply, section off things to say, we can only deal with it in a section by section basis. So again, I think one of the most important aspects of this work is this holistic, technical and scientific, ethical and commercial element. Another important part of this work is this human rights anchoring. It recognizes the need for human security, that for people to really relish and make use of their life chances, to make use of the opportunities as best they can in the situations that they find themselves, that the human rights paradigm is really the best place to do so. And that these are the types of concerns and considerations that should direct our attention as we move forward. Going on to some of the more minutiae elements over here, the things that sort of stand out to me, and this is purely a product of sort of my entry into the field, is how does AI safety relate to electoral integrity? And this certainly does cover it in the work that we have in front of us. But this is only going to increasingly become more of an issue as the sophistication of the products comes down into the hands of ordinary people, and also the costs of LLMs to be able to distill allows people to have easier to use products in their hands. So we do need to think about AI powered manipulation, because this is really the starting point for any democratic concern. If we can't have fair elections, or if there is AI unsafety, or if there are malfunctions or misuses in these integral processes, it's very hard to find a good common view on accepting the results that come from elections. That also links to questions about language bias and the types of hallucinations that may occur just simply because the African archive isn't encoded into some of these LLM models. And this gets us back to questions around information asymmetry and their global characteristics, the global injustices that organizations that Rachel and Samuel are part of are simply overturning or working to reduce those gaps. There's certainly another element over here that I think warrants more conversation, from all of us in this sector, and that is the kind of shallow regulation that comes from AI safety if it's simply left to be a global northern concern, or if it's simply left to be guided by the auspices of the big tech companies based in Silicon Valley or Shanghai or so on and so forth. The way that AI safety at the technical and the ethical level shape the field will certainly have long-term consequences for Africans. So this is a conversation we need to be part of, and we need to be part of it in a holistic fashion. If you just bear with me for one moment as I finish the last element of your question there, Rachel. If I had to think of sort of 5 key areas in order to take this work forward and to operationalize a bit of an institute, we do have to think about, as you said, institutional architecture and the type of multidimensional, multi-sector mandate that's required. This is beyond compliance and more about the power dynamics at play, and resolving those and addressing those can provide a bit of a doorway to economic opportunities. We also have to think about what transparency means over here at different levels. We have the transparency at the technological level with source code, training data, accessibility, but then also at the objective level when it comes to the computer programming, then even then at the decision-making level of people who are putting this type of software into circulation. The third element is around questions of knowledge sovereignty, which Samuel has really spoken well about. That includes language, which includes worldview, which includes cultural schema, but also speaks about cultural context and why these LLMs can be made useful through attention to AI safety and the like. We also need to think a little bit more about economic justice and how LLMs are starting to shape life chances. We can think of a very basic example. If there is no AI safety in human resources, we can start to have discriminations creep in there, and that greatly shapes both the workforce, yes, the citizenry, the ability to accumulate wealth, the ability to make your livelihoods, so on and so forth. So we do need to think at that level of economic justice. And I suppose the final point is the need for continental coordination. This is not simply a national level matter. It has national level components, but it's not only a national level. We need to think about the types of transnational coordination, given that AI safety is a transnational matter. So I will leave it there and pass the mic back to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Scott. That was really, really well-rounded and covered a number of key things. And I think this kind of issue that you laid out at the beginning, this is not just a technical issue. This is not just how do we red team these systems and jailbreak them from their safeguards. This is a much broader set of questions that's going to require much broader sets of kind of knowledge and discernment to understand when these risks arise, when incidences have taken place, how to link up governments and security agencies or all the different kind of responders that might be involved in this huge matrix of stakeholders that will be involved in managing and mitigating these risks. So thank you for highlighting that. And I think, you know, there's another question that's unresolved around how does this debate on AI safety overrun, or merge with the debate around AI ethics? Where does that ethical question sit? Where does the kind of question around morality and what's right and what's wrong in this space sit within questions of safety and security, which are often paradigms that kind of can be exclusive and can shut out historically or marginalized, underserved populations from a global perspective. Darlington, we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Darlington is the CEO, Darlington Okogo is the CEO and founder of Mino Health AI in Ghana, has been all over the world, and I have sat in a number of different meetings where your bioagent Moremi has been discussed, and particularly the paper you published about how you tested or stress tested this model. And I'll let you explain the story, but just to say I've been in many rooms around the world when this has been raised as a really kind of strong example of when leaders across the continent are taking full responsibility for the design and the impact and implications of the technologies that they're building. So, Darlington, over to you for your response and maybe talk to us a bit about Moremi.
Yeah, Rachel, thank you for having me, and thanks to the team too as well. Yeah, no, it's very interesting and quite a bit of a dilemma, right? On one hand, we are working on this technology that is super powerful and has so many positive application areas, but then at the same time, we are also warning of dangers, right? And so striking that balance, especially doing it from the point of view of a for-profit entity, right? Because if you're a for-profit entity, you don't speak badly about anything you work on. You make it sound all rosy. But for the magnitude of what we are working on, that wouldn't be very honest. So yes, to give a bit of context, basically, we have a company, Mino Health AI Labs, and we've been building AI systems for several years now, since 2016, which means we were very much at the start of the modern day AI era, which is when deep learning had a resurface and all of that stuff. But then we started working on generative AI around early 2023. Early 2023. And our goal was that we wanted to train a single AI system that would be general purpose and do several things across healthcare. So eventually that included clinical practice, but also biology. So we wanted a single AI system that could help diagnose, screen diseases, come up with treatment plan, and help with prescription of medications, but also can be used to design new drugs. So we basically ended up with Moremi BioAgent, which is an AI system that we trained on vast amount of biological data when it comes to everything drug design, antibody, vaccines. So we realized that the AI system basically got to a point where you can just give it a prompt in pure English. You can just say, I want a cancer drug, which is very vague in the space of biology. But the AI system can say, okay, if the user says they want a cancer drug, what are they referring to? What kind of drug do they want? They can be that vague, the AI system will kind of figure it out and do something. But you can also be very specific and tell it, I want a monoclonal antibody targeting the AMA1-1 complex for malaria. And then it would design an antibody, it would validate it by itself, it would do all this stuff. So it basically takes several months of work from biologists and does it in few minutes. The AI system comes up with a novel antibody that does not exist, and then it will validate it. So to do the blasting, it will check binding affinity, and then it will go into, molecular dynamics simulation, all the complex things that biologists would usually do in silico. The AI system will do it entirely by itself. But then I started wondering on the safety angle, if we train the AI system to be very good at understanding biology, to understand how to come up with agents that would influence human biology, what are the safety threats here? Because one thing, when you're doing drug discovery, one thing you do check for is toxicity level. So we realize that the AI system is quite good at predicting toxicity level. It's also quite good at designing around ideal toxicity level. Because if you ask it, design something that is safe for humans, it will usually go for things that are within toxicity levels that are acceptable. So then the question was, what if someone decided not to ask it that? What if someone asked it then come up with something that is harmful, right? So we took away the safety guardrail around it. So there's a lot of safety guardrails that if you naturally tell it that, it would just refuse it. It would be like, no, I wasn't intended for that purpose. But there are ways of overcoming that safety guardrails one way or the other. So we assume, what if that was the case? And then when we did, we realized that the AI system was just as good at designing highly toxic agents as it was at designing therapeutic agents. And so there is a bunch, there's at least, let's say, a threshold. There are some references like there are especially some of snake origins. Yeah, some snake toxins that are usually considered very poisonous, and then several other examples. But we realized that the AI system was able to come up. There's an in silico score, and the in silico score of the novel toxic agents that the AI system came up for were much worse than the known ones. So then we said, okay, this is a big problem. This, first of all, it's probably not wise to have this version of the AI system publicly available. But then the thought also occurred. We have identified this and we are willing to share that information. Is it possible there are bad actors out there that have identified the same thing and they've just kept quiet on it and they're potentially using it for exactly those purposes? So it becomes a red flag. We had a whole lot of internal debate on, should we make this public or not? Wouldn't it make us look bad? Wouldn't it mean that people will be scared of what we are doing? And all of them are like, well, we do have an obligation to share this. And because so even on the frontier level, they have Anthropic and the rest, they have all the safety benchmarks. And they do measure for biological warfare creation when it comes to frontier models. And all of them have come to the conclusion that AI systems are not yet capable of doing that. But then we realized basically that no, their AI systems are not capable of doing it because they were not trained with biological data sufficiently. But anyone who basically even without having access to what we did, if coincidentally they figured it out on their own too, with the intention of creating AI for biology applications, they can end up in the same scenario where they have an AI model that potentially can design biological warfare agents. And so, yeah, we shared this out there. And of course, some of the feedback would be, how is it any different from going to Google and pulling the sequence of a toxic agent? Yeah, but those are known toxic agents, which means that to some extent, we know what to do when we encounter them. We have antidotes. We know how to react to them. Some of them have been around since World War I, World War II. We've studied them. The danger of a novel toxic agent designed by an AI system. We even went further to see, okay, how far can the AI system go? It can design toxic agents that are colorless, odorless, and then can optimize for fatality in minutes. That's how far it goes. So basically, potentially right now, someone somewhere sitting in the world has access to some technology that they could design toxic agents that is new. None of us know about, none of us are prepared for. And if they released it somewhere, no one would see it and no one would know what would happen. I'm not trying to scare or spread fear, but then I don't think we are taking this seriously enough.
Jonathan, this is super fascinating. I was with sort of the Chief Digital Investigations Officer for Interpol who mentioned this. I was with a minister from the Caribbean who mentioned this. So this paper has had such significant impact all over the world. There's kind of two perspectives, or maybe three, but there's one perspective around what does somebody like you, who's a developer that's really trying to consciously build technology that changes the world and your country and nation and region for the better, what can you do? And it'd be really interesting to hear, just from a kind of layman's term, how you safeguard, from your perspective, a technology like Meremi. And then I guess there's the broader question we're also interested in here, which is from a kind of national and regional perspective, what do we need to do to kind of put legal enforcement around the kind of very significant risks that something like this poses? I think from a global perspective, one of the impacts that your paper had was to say that those kind of high level CBRN, so chemical, biological, radioactive, nuclear risks that we think of as kind of largely not relevant to the African context, a little bit more around biological, but it shows just how even within our continent, if there's really, really brilliant innovators that are designing these cutting edge technologies and thinking about all these variables, this kind of thing can occur. So yeah, maybe Darlington, you could just explain to us, how do you safeguard this?
Yeah, so the thing about safeguarding super powerful technologies is that it's never a fixed set of things. You always have to. It's kind of like hacking, right? So basically, what we did is the biochemical equivalent of white hat hacking, right? So, or equivalent of both white hat and gray hat hacking. So you need to do some of those, and that's a starting point. You need to understand. Look, you might not be looking for the negative use cases of your AI system, but you don't know what other people are thinking about. So you have to do those safety measures. We need to create more benchmark that checks for this. So there's a popular benchmark which is called WMDP, Weapons of Mass Destruction benchmark. It's good, but it's a knowledge-based benchmark. So it's asking the model questions like, oh, if you mix this and this, what do you usually get? Those are things that you can Google and get answers to. But we need novel benchmarks that test the design capabilities of this AI system. That is one. But also, there is a lot of guardrailing that you can do around your system, from everything from how you train the system. You could train your system in a way where, so this is usually called the alignment training. You ingrain alignment into your AI system so that at its very core, it knows behaviors that it should not do. Then also there's a system prompt level. Then there is checking user queries. So if someone puts a query in there, before your model starts answering, one of the possible solutions is that let a model specifically analyze that question to see that what is the nuance of it. So usually one way of jailbreaking AI systems is saying that, oh, I'm a researcher. I'm not actually trying to create toxic agents that will harm anyone. I'm just researching it for safety reasons and therefore come up with a new design. So I'll learn how to combat it. So you can have a model that can easily look at that and say, no, I don't care whether you're doing it for safety reasons. I'm still not going to design it. So there are all these different things. Of course, there's red teaming that you need to do. So you need to just give the AI system to expert. You need to validate them. But also, for me, I think in our paper, we stated it that we think there should be a UN level meeting, right? That seriously looks at this. It's so sad because our species is one that when it comes to certain things, we don't act until something happens. So prior to COVID, all the public health specialists that have been warning us for years about potential for pandemics and how globally we don't have the systems and we are not prepared, realistically would have cost us less money if we were prepared for a pandemic. But everyone is like, why should we allocate money for something that is theoretical? And then, they talked about the fact that literally was it months before the pandemic started, World Economic Forum and some partners like Gates Foundation organized a simulation where they brought world leaders together to say, look, this is a simulation. If there's a pandemic with our current system, we are not prepared enough to handle it. And everyone went home and went business as usual until the pandemic happened. Then, we realized that, okay, now everyone is starting a pandemic preparedness initiative post-COVID. We don't have to wait until AI is misused on that level before we decide to act. The unfortunate thing is that the technology is developing so rapidly that if we wait until that, we might not get that option. The difference is that COVID is biological, right? I mean, conspiracy theorists have something else to say about that, but we don't care about them. But COVID happened naturally, right? And the difference is that the probability of getting back-to-back pathogens that cause global level pandemic is not realistic. But if it is human driven and it is bad actors and they have a technology that they are misusing, nothing stops them from doing it back to back. So if you are being reactive, you're too late. So even on that level, we need to now start putting in safety guards. Again, I'm on the application level. I'm not for a scenario where basically we now heavily regulate AI system that says that even if you are, an undergrad kid and you want to train some small model on Google Colab, you are not allowed. It's illegal. It's only, the Minister of Public Security or someone that can approve you training a tiny model. No, that's not what I'm asking for. But then at the same time, we need to realize that this is not just some models for, drafting emails and students doing their homework. They are capable of way more than that. And I don't think that we are putting it. So I'm not, there's a scientific level, there's work that needs to be done on a technical level, but there's also a global initiative that needs to be done on a governmental level. There needs to be treaties where, for example, member states, we treat it the same way. AI has been compared to nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, which for quite some time didn't feel like a good comparison. But with what we have seen in biology and the capabilities, it's very much a fair comparison now. So if that is the case, maybe look at global treaties where member states of the UN say that we would not use AI for biological and chemical warfare. Let them sign that so that if anyone has any activity, the same way we track WMD activities, and we can say that, okay, we are seeing some activities here showing that someone is breaching some treaties. Let's have the same thing. And if you see someone running chemical experiment or they have like a huge chunk of GPUs hidden somewhere and the use cases are not very clear, they should be called before the UN to explain it. So I'm hoping that we don't wait for things to go bad before we realize that this is much serious than we're currently taking it.
Thank you so much, Darlington. I think you've explained that super clearly. And it is really about our kind of tolerance of risk, right? And understanding quite how significant these risks are and quite how accessible it is for anybody with a computer to be able to do something that could be potentially really harmful. So I'm going to go to the questions in the chat, and this leads quite nicely to one of the questions here that's indicating that, within an African context, yes, we can push for certain reforms and develop certain standards that would be binding for African innovators. But how do we tackle being able to influence the design of technologies that are safe for the African context when many technologies come from abroad, from the US or China, etc. And I think this was for a long time one of the key reasons why we didn't have AI safety institutes in many parts of the world, is there was this idea that an AI safety institute had to be located where it had jurisdictional access to some of the kind of AI labs that were designing frontier technologies, and they could compel them to share certain information. I think Darlington, what Moremi does is completely undermines that trope and says anyone can develop, well, not anyone, but technologies that are frontier can be developed anywhere in the world. So, Samuel, maybe I can turn to you to respond to this question about how do we ensure those kinds of policies that influence big tech and shape how big tech designs safe AI have impact here.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think the biggest challenge has always been that policies and regulations catch up with the technology itself and the pace of the innovation. So I'd like to give this example that if when the EU started writing the EU AI Act, if they had released it that year, they would be regulating a totally different system from what we currently have with AI models. And these systems, significantly, we see the leap. We barely were done with ChatGPT 4.0, and then we've got ChatGPT 5, and then we continue to see several of those iterations of frontier models. Perhaps what is most important now is that we are beginning to see a push for a regulation that is both internal mechanisms from these organizations, and we're also seeing international regulation. So, for instance, the EU AI Act, although it's a risk-based regulatory approach, it's been happening. We're also seeing that there is some sort of safety level framework within organizations. So Anthropic leads in this regard, like, ensuring that their models are safe, publishing, some of the test results of these things. Also, I think the folks at Google DeepMinds also do a very good job with these internal mechanisms where they publish some of the reports pointing out that, these are the extensive work we've done with this. And there's also oftentimes a safety report that is published. I think in February, OpenAI published a safety report that showed, how they were able to like clamp down on certain accounts that were used for, say, propaganda, and then some used for violent extremist recruiting, and the like. So I think internal mechanisms go a long way. That would be over time become sort of like a demand you make in much the same way you place that sort of demand from, say, if you're working with a vendor and you're trying to procure a software, you want to ensure that it's gone through elaborate stress testing. And I think countries will begin to demand that if these AI models are going to be deployed within their borders, they want to ensure that these systems are robust enough and these systems have been tested enough to ensure that they are safe to use. As to how much regulations can have an impact, that I mean, it will require the mechanisms for enforcing those regulations. We see this with data protection on the continent, where, like for instance, Nigeria has sued Meta and placed, I think, about a 1 point something billion fine on Meta, largely because it felt it contravened its data protection regulation. So I think the enforcement part of it would be a very crucial part to ensure that the AI is safely deployed on the continent.
Thanks, Sam. And I think one of the things you're also pointing to is that need for capacity, institutions, people on the continent that are dedicated to stress testing, red teaming these technologies with African concerns in mind. So I think that kind of local kind of interrogation from local awareness about what the risks might be, what the particular kind of factors that might affect how a technology could be misused is particularly important. Scott, I wanted to turn to you to respond to the question about the kind of institutional and infrastructure readiness for AI safety on the continent, and the kind of overall question, does the continent appear ready to deploy AI responsibly or safely in the near future? Scott.
Thanks, Rachel. I mean, I think involved in that question is also the matters of cost. Like, and there's a bit of a subtext, like, is this something that Africans should invest in, given all the other competing priorities on our, that garner our attention? And to me, I would think about it the other way. It's a moment where we can't not invest, because AI safety is linked to so many other sets of concerns. And I'll pick two of them just to drill the point home a little bit. If we think about AI safety as a peacemaking exercise, we think of Agenda 2063, Silencing the Guns initiative. Well, that is an AI safety matter. If we want to think about peacekeeping, peace building, bringing safety and security to our peoples, well, then this becomes an AI safety matter too. And so, that is something that we now have to channel resources to. The next matter is one of commerce, and it is a bit of a dirty matter around commerce. But what we are talking about when it comes to AI safety is also market making on a continental scale. If we cannot have safe cross-border data flows, very few people will want to trade with us as well. So we also need to understand that AI safety, as much as it is about chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, discrimination in the workplace, and all these other matters too, it's also about the vast economic opportunities that we have in front of us. If we don't create safe working environments for AI, then it's unlikely that we'll be able to participate in European markets, or our products will be able to fit in European markets. So we have to think about suitable negotiation around market access and what kinds of markets we want to make and what kinds of opportunities we want to make. And so my final point is this. This is an area that we cannot afford to neglect, because if we simply divert the costs elsewhere, then we'll find that it's going to end up being very expensive for us in downstream in the decades ahead.
Thanks, Scott. And I think that really echoes what Darlington was saying about we cannot wait for a catastrophe like a pandemic to occur, which causes wide-scale economic loss, when we have the opportunity now to invest in ensuring these technologies are safely designed, safely deployed, and we have the kind of infrastructure and capacity across the continent. And I think that point, Scott, you made this as well about the coordination regionally is so important. We need to kind of be thinking about these things now. And I know, Sam, you had emphasized that within the paper, the need to kind of engage at an AU level to kind of coordinate and cooperate in managing some of these issues that are never contained within one border. Thank you. I'm mindful that we're heading towards time. There's been some really, really interesting questions put in the chat. Darlington, there's questions for you from someone also in Ghana asking about your relationship with higher education institutions. I know you collaborate a lot with universities all over the world. And there's also a question about how you've taken off safeguards. So I think if you don't mind coming in for just 1 second, because there's a few questions for you, and then we'll wrap up quickly.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, we do work with quite a number of universities, like you mentioned. So on the positive applications of AI in health and biology, for example, we actually leveraging Moremi BioAgent to create both new drugs or new drugs, antibodies, vaccines, and new diagnostics for malaria. Later today, I'll be meeting a team from some UK university where we are looking at it for gonorrhea, meningitis, and a number of other things. So on the positive side, we're leveraging the AI for that, but also on the safety side, it's working with the domain expert to better understand, okay, what are some safeguards that we can put in? Because right now they're basically creating robotic wet labs around the world where you can send a sequence and have it synthesized. What are some checks that we can propose to avoid some of those? There was another question. Sorry, I missed the other question.
There was one question about how did you actually take off the safeguards when you did the testing?
Yeah, well, I obviously can't go into too much detail because then that's kind
Okay.
of doing the opposite of the whole objective. But it's just basically it's on doing the safety measures that you had put in the first place. So it happens at the system prompt level, it happens at the safety training level. But of course, if I go into much details, then I'm encouraging the wrong things here.
Thank you, Darlington, and thank you for the quick responses. Thank you all for joining today's session. It's been a very, very, very interesting discussion. I encourage you to read the paper that Samuel's led. I encourage you to read Darlington's paper. Scott's also written a number of things on this field and related topics. We've got another webinar in this series coming up on AI and science in Africa. We've got another one later in the year around artificial general intelligence and superintelligence and development. So we're really looking to kind of get into these nitty-gritty, hard, interesting, big questions around AI and why they matter and why they should matter for an African context. So thank you all for joining and hope to see you all soon. Bye.